The morning fog clings to the Polat Gorge like a burial shroud, slow and heavy, unwilling to release its grip on the ravine below. It is September of 1869, and the first hammer blows have not yet fallen. Up here, nearly 1,000 meters above sea level, the air carries the bite of approaching autumn. The only sounds are wind through pine needles and the distant rush of a waterfall cascading 150 feet into the rocks below. The plateau is silent, empty. The medieval ruins of Neuschwanstein crouch at the edge of the precipice, their crumbling stones watching over the valley as they have for centuries, waiting for someone to give them purpose again. In a few weeks, men will arrive with pickaxes and dynamite. They will lower ropes down cliff faces and haul timber up mountain paths too narrow for wagons. They will work through rain, through snow, through blistering summers that offer no shade on exposed rock. Some of them will be injured. A few may die. For 17 years, an army of craftsmen will climb this mountain in darkness before dawn and descend in darkness after dusk, their hands raw from limestone and mortar, their backs bent under loads of marble and bronze. And for what? For the dream of a single man, a king who believed he could build himself out of loneliness, a monarch who saw the mountains not as obstacles, but as pedestals for a vision that existed nowhere except inside his own tortured mind. When the castle finally rose from the ruins, white limestone walls catching the first light of morning like something conjured from a fairy tale, the world would call it beautiful. They would call it magical. They would call it the most romantic castle in Europe, a vision from a medieval legend made impossibly real. What they would not call it, because they would not know, was what it truly was. The most expensive act of escapism in human history, a monument to the unbearable weight of being a king, and a burden that would outlast its creator by more than a century, demanding payment long after the last stone was laid. This is the story of Neuschwanstein, not the fairy tale, the truth. To understand what rose on that mountain, we must first understand the man who ordered it built, and to understand Ludwig, we must understand the particular alchemy of inheritance and isolation that shaped him into the strangest king Bavaria ever knew. Ludwig Otto Friedrich Wilhelm was born on August 25, 1845, in Nymphenburg Palace, Munich. His arrival was marked by cannon fire and cathedral bells, as befitting the heir to the Bavarian throne. His grandfather, Ludwig I, had been forced to abdicate after a scandalous affair. His father, Maximilian II, was a serious man, bookish and reserved, more interested in scholarship than spectacle. The household Ludwig grew up in was one of duty and distance. Affection was not demonstrated. Expectations were not explained. They simply existed, like gravity, pressing down on a young prince who wanted nothing more than to escape into stories. Ludwig found his refuge in mythology, in the legends of Lohengrin and Tannhäuser, in the swan nights of Germanic folklore. While other boys his age learned to hunt and fence, Ludwig memorized operas. While his tutors prepared him for statecraft, he sketched castles in the margins of his notebooks, fantastical structures that existed in no architectural tradition, only in the landscapes of his imagination. His mother, Marie of Prussia, was cold and distant. His father was preoccupied. His younger brother Otto would later descend into madness so severe he would spend decades in confinement. The seeds of instability ran deep in the Wittelsbach bloodline, though no one spoke of it aloud. When Ludwig was 18 years old, his father died unexpectedly during a hunting trip. The young prince, unprepared and overwhelmed, became King Ludwig II of Bavaria. He was tall, strikingly handsome, and almost pathologically shy. He hated public appearances. He resented the demands of government. He had no interest in politics, in military affairs, in the grinding machinery of state that consumed every hour of a monarch's day. What could he wanted? The only thing he truly wanted was to be left alone with his dreams. Within months of taking the throne, Ludwig made the decision that would define his reign. He summoned the composer Richard Wagner to Munich. Wagner was a fugitive at the time, fleeing creditors across half of Europe. His revolutionary operas condemned as dangerous by conservative critics and embraced as genius by the young and idealistic. Ludwig had discovered Wagner's music as a teenager and had fallen into it with the intensity of religious conversion. Here, in these operas, was everything Ludwig believed existence should be: heroism, tragedy, beauty, unbounded by the compromises of the real world. Tannhäuser spoke of the agony of the artist misunderstood by society. Lohengrin told of a swan knight whose identity must remain secret, whose isolation was the price of his power. Ludwig saw himself in every note. When the two men met for the first time in May of 1864, Wagner wept. Ludwig paid off the composer's debts, a staggering sum that would have kept a working-class family comfortable for generations. He installed Wagner in a lavish villa. He funded productions of operas that no other theater in Europe would touch. For a brief, ecstatic period, the young king believed he had found a soulmate, someone who understood that life without art was not worth living. But the relationship was doomed by its own intensity. Wagner was manipulative, constantly demanding more money, more influence, more access. The Bavarian ministers despised him as a foreign extravagance, bleeding the royal coffers. Within 2 years, public pressure forced Ludwig to send Wagner away from Munich. Though their correspondence would continue for decades, letters thick with mutual admiration and barely suppressed need. Ludwig never recovered from the betrayal he felt, not by Wagner himself, who remained grateful, but by the world that had forced the separation. If society would not let him build his ideal existence in Munich, he would build it somewhere else, somewhere no one could reach, somewhere high in the mountains where the only sounds were wind and water and the music playing endlessly in his own mind. The site Ludwig chose was no accident. The ruins of Vorderhohenschwangau sat on a narrow ridge in the Bavarian Alps, overlooking the valley where he had spent his happiest childhood summers. Hohenschwangau Castle, his family's country retreat, stood visible across the gorge, a 19th-century reconstruction of a medieval fortress painted in bright yellows and filled with murals of the very legends Ludwig adored. He had grown up in that castle, staring at painted scenes of Lohengrin and Tannhäuser, absorbing them into his blood. Now he would build something greater, something that would dwarf his childhood home and announce to the world, or at least to himself, that he was not merely inheriting legend, but creating it. The initial plans were drawn not by an architect, but by a theatrical set designer named Christian Jank. This detail matters. Ludwig was not interested in a functioning palace. He was interested in an image. Jank's watercolors showed a structure that seemed impossible: soaring towers, romantic battlements, graceful arches suspended against a backdrop of mountain and sky. It looked like something from an illuminated manuscript, a cathedral and a fortress and a dream made solid. The practical architects brought in to execute the vision, first Eduard Riedel, then Georg von Dolman, found themselves constantly at war with Ludwig's demands. The king did not care about load-bearing walls or construction sequences. He cared about sightlines. He cared about how the moonlight would fall through a particular window onto a particular tapestry. He cared about whether the throne room would feel sufficiently transcendent when he sat alone in it at midnight, listening to the silence. What emerged from this collision of fantasy and engineering was unlike anything the world had seen. Construction began in earnest in the summer of 1869. The first task was not building, but destroying. The medieval ruins had to be cleared away, and the rocky plateau beneath them had to be reshaped. Workers descended with ropes and dynamite, blasting through the limestone ridge to lower it by nearly 8 meters and create a level foundation. The debris, hundreds of tons of shattered stone, was carted away by hand and by horse, down paths so steep that one wrong step could send a man plummeting into the gorge below. Consider the logistics for a moment. The site sat almost 1,000 meters above sea level, accessible only by a winding mountain road that turned to mud in rain and ice in winter. Every brick, every beam, every pane of glass had to be transported from the valley floor. In the early years, horses pulled wagons as far as they could go, and then human muscle took over. Later, a steam-powered crane was installed on the construction site, one of the most advanced lifting mechanisms of its era, capable of hoisting materials 30 meters straight up the cliff face. But even this marvel of engineering could not solve every problem. The white limestone that would clad the castle's exterior came from quarries in the valley and had to be cut to precise specifications, then hauled upward and fitted into place by masons working on scaffolding so precarious that modern safety inspectors would have shut down the entire project. At the peak of construction, more than 200 workers lived and labored on the mountain simultaneously. Carpenters, stonemasons, ironworkers, gilders, painters, sculptors, each trade operating on different floors and in different sections of the growing structure, their work overlapping and sometimes conflicting as Ludwig's plans evolved in real time. The king was notorious for changing his mind. A room that had been designed with one ceiling might suddenly require a different one. A window that had been framed might need to be widened or moved entirely. The architects pleaded for consistency. Ludwig ignored them. He was building a dream, and dreams do not hold still. The numbers tell part of the story, but only part. The throne room alone contains over 6,000 square feet of mosaic flooring, each tiny piece of colored stone set by hand in patterns depicting Byzantine emperors and Christian saints. The ceiling above rises 40 feet, painted in deep blue and gold to represent the heavens, with a massive chandelier in the shape of a Byzantine crown suspended from its center. A chandelier so heavy that its installation required the construction of temporary reinforcements to prevent the ceiling from collapsing. Ludwig never saw it completed. By the time of his death in 1886, the throne room remained unfinished, the throne itself never installed. The empty dais still waits there, a vacancy at the heart of the most elaborate room in the castle, as if expecting a king who will never return. The Singers' Hall occupies the entire 4th floor of the Palace, the main residential building. Its design was inspired by the Wartburg, a medieval castle in Thuringia associated with the legendary song contest depicted in Wagner's Tannhäuser. Ludwig's version stretches over 200 feet in length, its walls covered in murals illustrating the saga of Parsifal, the Grail Knight, commissioned from some of the finest history painters in Germany. The hall was never used for performances during Ludwig's lifetime. It was never used for anything. Ludwig built it not for gatherings, but for solitude, for the private pleasure of walking through a space that existed nowhere else in the world, surrounded by images of the sacred and the heroic. The king's bedroom is smaller but no less extravagant. Every surface is carved, gilded, or painted. The bed canopy alone required 14 woodcarvers working for over 4 years to complete, its Gothic tracery rising toward the ceiling like the interior of a cathedral. The windows are stained glass, filtering the mountain light into shifting patterns of blue and purple. A reading nook is built into one wall where Ludwig would sit for hours with his books, the silence broken only by the ticking of an ornate clock and the occasional cry of an eagle riding the thermals above the gorge. But beneath all this beauty lay systems that no visitor was meant to see. A castle is not merely walls and towers. A castle is a living organism, requiring constant inputs of water, heat, and light, requiring waste to be removed and supplies to be replenished. Ludwig understood this, and he insisted that Neuschwanstein be equipped with the most advanced technology of its age, not because he cared about efficiency, but because he could not tolerate any intrusion of the mundane into his carefully constructed fantasy. If servants had to carry water buckets through the halls, the spell would be broken. If coal smoke drifted into the throne room, the illusion would collapse. The invisible systems had to be truly invisible. Running water was piped from a spring 200 meters above the castle, using a system of conduits and reservoirs that would have been impressive in any major city, let alone on a remote alpine peak. The kitchens, located on the lower floors, were connected to the dining rooms above by an elaborate network of dumbwaiters and speaking tubes, allowing meals to appear as if by magic. A central heating system, powered by a massive furnace in the basement, circulated warm air through ducts concealed within the walls, eliminating the need for visible fireplaces in most rooms. The castle even had a telephone connection to Munich, installed in 1886, making Ludwig one of the first monarchs in Europe to have instant voice communication with his capital. To maintain all this required an army of servants, footmen and chambermaids, cooks and gardeners, stokers to feed the furnaces, and mechanics to maintain the machinery. At any given time during Ludwig's occupancy, dozens of staff members moved through the lower corridors and service passages, carrying out their duties in spaces designed to be as cramped and utilitarian as the public rooms were grand. They slept in narrow quarters. They worked in shifts. They were forbidden from being seen by the king unless absolutely necessary. Ludwig wanted to believe he was alone in his castle, attended only by ghosts and dreams. The servants made this illusion possible at considerable cost to their own visibility and dignity. The question of money was always present, like a bass note rumbling beneath the music of construction. Ludwig was not spending state funds. The Bavarian constitution made clear that the civil list, the allowance provided to the monarchy, was his to use as he wished. But the civil list had limits, and Ludwig's ambitions had none. By the mid-1870s, Neuschwanstein was far from complete, and Ludwig was already planning his next projects: Linderhof, a smaller palace in the Rococo style; Herrenchiemsee, a massive replica of Versailles to be built on an island in a Bavarian lake. Each new dream drained resources from the ones before. The original budget for Neuschwanstein had been estimated at around 3.2 million marks. By the time of Ludwig's death, the actual cost had exceeded 6 million marks, and the castle was still unfinished. Modern estimates, adjusted for inflation, place the total expenditure at several hundred million euros in contemporary terms. Ludwig borrowed against his future allowances. He took out loans from banks, from family members, from anyone willing to extend credit to a king whose collateral was nothing more than his own increasingly fragile credibility. His ministers pleaded with him to stop, or at least to slow down. Ludwig responded by dismissing ministers who objected and replacing them with more compliant functionaries. The laborers themselves were paid, but barely. Construction work in the 19th century was brutal and precarious. Men who were injured on the job had little recourse. Families who lost their breadwinners to accidents or illness faced destitution. The wages Ludwig offered were competitive for the era, but the era itself was harsh. A skilled mason might earn enough to support his family, but an unskilled laborer, the kind who hauled stone or cleared debris, earned barely enough to survive. Many of these men came from the surrounding villages, supplementing their income from farming or forestry with seasonal work on the king's impossible project. They built his dream with their bodies, and when the dream was done, they returned to lives of ordinary struggle, carrying the physical toll of the work in their backs and joints for the rest of their days. Ludwig himself rarely visited the construction site during the daylight hours when workers were present. He came at night, by carriage, accompanied only by a few trusted servants, and the darkness he preferred. He would wander through the unfinished rooms with a lantern, inspecting progress, imagining how the spaces would look when completed. He spoke to no one. He gave his instructions in writing, detailed letters to the architects specifying changes and additions, his handwriting growing more erratic as the years passed. The workers became used to arriving in the morning to find evidence of his nocturnal visits, footprints in the sawdust, notes pinned to door frames, half-eaten meals abandoned on scaffolding. This was not the behavior of a healthy man. Ludwig's eccentricities, which had seemed charming in his youth, became more pronounced and more troubling as he aged. He slept during the day and woke at dusk. He ate alone, setting places at his table for the ghosts of historical figures, Louis XIV, Marie Antoinette, and conversing with them as if they were present. He refused to see visitors, even family members, for months at a time. He gained weight and neglected his appearance, his legendary beauty fading into something bloated and sad. His finances deteriorated, and with them, his grip on reality. By 1885, the situation had become untenable. Ludwig's debts were so severe that he could no longer meet the payroll for his construction workers or the operating costs of his castles. He attempted to borrow money from foreign governments, sending envoys to beg for loans from the rulers of France, Prussia, and even the Ottoman Empire. All refused. The Bavarian cabinet, increasingly desperate, began discussing the possibility of deposing their king on the grounds of mental incapacity. A commission of doctors was assembled to examine evidence of Ludwig's behavior, though none of them ever actually examined Ludwig himself. On June 9, 1886, the commission issued its verdict. Ludwig II was insane and unfit to rule. The king learned of his deposition while at Neuschwanstein, his unfinished refuge, surrounded by walls that could not protect him from the powers conspiring below. A delegation arrived to take him into custody, but local villagers, loyal to their king, whatever his eccentricities, initially blocked the roads and allowed Ludwig to escape. The respite was brief. A second delegation arrived the following day, accompanied by armed guards, and this time there was no resistance. Ludwig was transported to Berg Castle on Lake Starnberg, where he would be held under the supervision of Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, the physician who had certified him insane. On the evening of June 13, 1886, Ludwig and Gudden went for a walk along the lakeshore. Neither of them returned. Their bodies were found floating in the shallow water later that night, Gudden showing signs of strangulation and a blow to the head, Ludwig unmarked and dead from no discernible cause. The water where they drowned was less than waist deep. The official verdict was suicide by drowning. No one believed it then. No one believes it now. The truth of what happened at Lake Starnberg remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of European history. Was Ludwig murdered by agents of the Bavarian government who feared what he might do if he regained power? Did he attempt to escape and die in a struggle with his physician? Did he simply walk into the water and allow himself to sink, overwhelmed at last by a world that had no room for his dreams? The theories multiply, but the facts remain hidden, lost beneath the dark surface of the lake. Ludwig was 40 years old when he died. He had occupied Neuschwanstein for a total of 172 nights. What happened next would have horrified him. Within weeks of Ludwig's death, the Bavarian government opened Neuschwanstein to the public. The castle that had been designed as a retreat from the world became the world's most popular destination. Visitors arrived by the thousands, then tens of thousands, eager to gawk at the eccentricities of the mad king, to marvel at the beauty he had created and whisper about the tragic end he had met. Admission fees were collected at the gate. The debts Ludwig had accumulated were paid off within decades, his castles generating more revenue dead than he had ever imagined possible alive. There is a particular irony in this. Ludwig had built Neuschwanstein as an escape from the obligations of monarchy, from the public gaze, from the demands of a world he found intolerable. And yet his escape became the most public space in Bavaria. The rooms where he had walked alone are now walked by thousands every day. The Singers' Hall, which never heard a single performance in his lifetime, now echoes with the shuffling of tour groups and the click of cameras. The bedroom where he slept in velvet darkness is lit by fluorescent tubes so visitors can see every carved detail. Ludwig wanted solitude. He got immortality. It is unclear whether he would have considered this a fair trade. The first decades after Ludwig's death established patterns that would persist for more than a century. The Bavarian state assumed ownership of the castle and responsibility for its maintenance. Staff members were retained, guides and groundskeepers, maintenance workers and administrators, and the building was kept in reasonable condition through a combination of admission revenue and occasional government subsidies. But reasonable condition was not the same as excellent condition, and the years took their toll. Consider what exposure does to a building on a mountain. The limestone facade, brilliant white when first installed, absorbed moisture and pollutants, developing a patina of gray and black that dulled its fairy tale gleam. The wooden elements, window frames, balconies, the intricate carved work on the towers, weathered and cracked in the extreme temperature swings of the alpine climate. Freezing winters followed by warm summers caused the mortar between stones to expand and contract, opening cracks through which water could penetrate. Water is the great enemy of architecture. Given enough time and enough cycles of freezing and thawing, water will tear apart the strongest stone. The interior suffered differently. Humidity was a constant concern. The murals, painted with techniques designed for stable museum conditions, began to flake and fade. The gilding lost its luster. The fabrics on chairs and beds absorbed dust and light, their colors slowly draining away. Visitors themselves became a source of damage. The carbon dioxide from their breath altered the air chemistry. The oils from their hands left invisible traces on every surface they touched. The weight of their footsteps wore grooves into the wooden floors. Preservation and access existed in perpetual tension, each one threatening to undermine the other. The 20th century brought catastrophe to Germany, and Neuschwanstein did not escape entirely unscathed. During the First World War, the castle was far from the front lines, but the economic devastation that followed the armistice affected every institution in the country. The Bavarian Palace administration saw its budgets slashed. Maintenance was deferred, staff were laid off. The castle continued to attract visitors, but the infrastructure supporting it crumbled slowly and almost invisibly, the kind of decay that becomes visible only when it is nearly too late to reverse. The Second World War brought more direct threats. Nazi Germany was obsessed with symbols of Germanic heritage, and Neuschwanstein, with its medieval imagery and Wagnerian associations, fit neatly into the mythology the regime sought to construct. The castle was spared destruction, but it was put to use in ways Ludwig could never have anticipated. Toward the end of the war, as Allied bombing devastated German cities, the Nazi regime used Neuschwanstein as a repository for looted art. Paintings stolen from Jewish collectors, sculptures seized from occupied countries, treasures plundered from museums across Europe. All of this was trucked to the Bavarian Alps and stored in the castle's basement and in caves carved into the surrounding mountains. When American soldiers arrived in the spring of 1945, they found Neuschwanstein transformed into a warehouse of stolen culture. More than 6,000 works of art were catalogued and eventually repatriated, a process that took years and, in some cases, remains incomplete to this day. The castle itself survived the war intact, though the chaos of the final months left records scattered and the building neglected. Liberation was followed by occupation, and occupation was followed by reconstruction. And through it all, the castle on the mountain waited, watching the valley below as it had for 3/4 of a century, patient as only stone can be. The Bavarian Palace administration regained full control in the post-war years, but the institution was now operating in a transformed world. West Germany's economic miracle brought prosperity, but also rising expectations. Tourists expected more. They expected gift shops and guided tours, clean restrooms and accessible pathways. They expected the castle to be maintained to a standard befitting its reputation. And they came in numbers that Ludwig could never have imagined. By the 1960s, annual visitor counts exceeded 500,000. By the 1980s, the number had doubled. By the turn of the millennium, Neuschwanstein was receiving approximately 1.4 million visitors per year, making it one of the most visited tourist attractions in Europe. The village of Hohenschwangau, once a quiet farming community at the base of the mountains, was transformed into a hub of hotels, restaurants, and souvenir shops. Tour buses arrived in convoys. The winding road to the castle, originally designed for horse-drawn carriages, became a bottleneck of pedestrians and horse-drawn wagons offering rides to tourists, unwilling to make the 30-minute climb on foot. The pressure on the building was immense. Consider what it means to move 1.4 million bodies through a structure designed for solitude. The tour route was carefully controlled. Visitors herded in groups of no more than 60, each group spending exactly 35 minutes inside before being ushered out to make room for the next. Even so, the cumulative impact was staggering. The floor in the throne room, crossed by thousands of feet every day, wore thin. The air quality in enclosed spaces deteriorated despite modern ventilation systems. The fabric of the building itself, the mortar, the wood, the metal fittings, absorbed the stress of continuous use, and stress without relief becomes damage. The revenue from admission tickets was substantial, but so were the costs. A building like Neuschwanstein cannot be maintained like an ordinary structure. Every repair requires specialized knowledge. The techniques used to restore 19th century gilding are not the same as those used in modern construction. Craftsmen with the appropriate skills are rare and expensive. Materials must often be custom manufactured to match the original specifications. A single restoration project, repointing the limestone facade, for example, or stabilizing the wooden balconies, can cost millions of euros and take years to complete. The Bavarian Palace administration operates under a model of self-financing, meaning that the revenue generated by the palaces under its care is expected to cover the costs of maintaining them. In theory, Neuschwanstein more than carries its weight. In practice, the situation is more complicated. The castle generates significant income, but it also requires significant investment. Conservation projects must be planned years in advance, their costs estimated and budgeted against projected ticket sales. When visitor numbers drop, as they did during economic recessions, as they did more dramatically during the global pandemic of 2020, the entire financial model is thrown into uncertainty. Staff members number in the dozens for Neuschwanstein alone. Guides lead tours in multiple languages, speaking the same scripts thousands of times per season, answering the same questions, managing the same crowds. Custodians clean the castle every night after the visitors leave, sweeping floors and dusting surfaces and checking for damage. Security personnel monitor the grounds around the clock, protecting against vandalism and theft. Maintenance crews work on a rotating schedule of inspections and repairs, addressing small problems before they become large ones, tracking the condition of every element, every window, every piece of carved wood, every painted surface, in meticulous databases that would have been unimaginable in Ludwig's time. And then there are the specialists, art conservators who spend months restoring a single mural, stone experts who analyze the chemical composition of the limestone and prescribe treatments to slow its deterioration, mechanical engineers who maintain the 19th century technology, the heating system, the water supply, the remaining functional elements of the original infrastructure, keeping century-old machinery operational with a combination of original parts and modern improvisations. These people work largely unseen, their labor invisible to the visitors who walk through the finished rooms and marvel at the beauty. Without them, the beauty would not survive a decade. The modern visitor to Neuschwanstein experiences a carefully choreographed illusion. The path up the mountain is managed to feel romantic, but not arduous. The ticketing system is computerized, time slots assigned in advance to prevent overcrowding. Audio guides are available in over a dozen languages, narrated by voices warm and professional, telling stories of Ludwig and Wagner and the tragic romance of a king who died for his dreams. What the audio guides do not mention are the generators humming in the basements, the climate control systems monitoring humidity to within a fraction of a percent, the scaffolding hidden behind decorative screens in rooms closed to the public, where conservation work proceeds at the pace of medieval craftsmanship. The fire suppression systems woven through walls and ceilings, invisible until needed, capable of protecting irreplaceable artworks from the flames that have destroyed so many historic buildings. The security cameras watching every angle, recording every movement, storing terabytes of footage that is reviewed and analyzed and archived. The modern castle is not the same structure Ludwig built. It cannot be. 130 years of repair and restoration have replaced materials, reinforced structures, altered systems in ways both visible and invisible. The question of authenticity becomes philosophical. If every beam has been replaced, is it still the same castle? The answer, for most visitors, is yes. What matters is the experience, the sensation of walking through rooms where Ludwig once walked, seeing what he saw, feeling what he felt. Whether the wood beneath their feet was milled in 1870 or 2010 is irrelevant. The dream persists. But dreams require payment, and the question of who pays and how much and at what cost to other priorities is never fully resolved. The Bavarian government subsidizes the palace administration when revenue falls short, but those subsidies come from tax revenues that could fund schools or hospitals or infrastructure. The tourists who visit Neuschwanstein contribute to the local economy, but they also strain it. The roads require maintenance, the environment requires protection, the services required by 1 million+ annual visitors must be planned and provided. The workers who maintain the castle and guide the tours are paid wages that are decent by European standards, but the work is demanding and often repetitive, and the seasonal nature of tourism means that many positions are temporary or insecure, and the castle itself pays a price. Every footstep wears the floor a little thinner. Every breath adds moisture to the air. Every camera flash, in the days before flash photography was banned, bombarded fragile surfaces with light that accelerated their decay. The building is not a museum in the usual sense, a neutral container for valuable objects, but is itself the valuable object, and every use damages it slightly, accumulating over years into degradation that must be reversed through expensive intervention. Preservation is not a one-time achievement, but a continuous process, a treadmill that can never stop. Climate change adds new uncertainty. The alpine environment that Ludwig chose for its pristine beauty is warming, the freeze-thaw cycles growing more intense, the weather patterns more erratic. Rainstorms that once fell predictably now arrive in violent bursts that overwhelm drainage systems designed for gentler conditions. Snow loads on the towers fluctuate in ways that stress the structural calculations of 19th-century engineers. The forests surrounding the castle face their own pressures: bark beetle infestations, drought stress, the gradual shift of habitable zones higher up the mountains. The setting that made Neuschwanstein magical is itself under threat. The palace administration responds with long-term planning exercises, modeling various climate scenarios and their implications for the building's future. But planning can only go so far. If temperatures continue to rise, if extreme weather becomes more frequent, if the economic base that supports tourism contracts, then the assumptions underlying the entire preservation effort will have to be revisited. Difficult questions will arise. How much money should be spent maintaining a single building when the world faces systemic crises? At what point does nostalgia become irresponsible? These are not hypothetical questions. They are already being asked quietly in administrative offices and academic conferences and planning documents that the public never sees. To stand in the courtyard of Neuschwanstein in the early morning before the tour buses arrive is to experience something of what Ludwig must have felt. The fog rises from the gorge. The mountains frame the sky. The towers catch the first light and glow with an otherworldly pallor, their whiteness almost impossible against the dark green of the forests. For a few minutes, you can believe the fairy tale. Then, the first tour group appears, the guides raise their flags, the visitors jostle for photographs, the day's commerce begins, and the castle transforms from a private dream into a public commodity, consumed and discarded and consumed again by an endless stream of strangers who know nothing of the men who died, quarrying the stone, the women who cleaned the halls, the bureaucrats who balance the books, the craftsmen who repair the damage year after year after year. Ludwig built Neuschwanstein to escape from the world. He failed. The world found him here, dragged him from his sanctuary, and killed him. Whether by his own hand or another's, the effect was the same. And then the world moved in. The world made itself at home. The world turned his most private refuge into its most public spectacle. And in doing so, both preserved and violated everything he had created. The question of who paid for Neuschwanstein has no single answer. Ludwig paid with his fortune, his sanity, and eventually his life. The laborers paid with their bodies, their years, their physical capacity. The Bavarian people paid through a monarchy that grew increasingly detached from their concerns, spending on fantasy what might have been spent on their welfare. Later generations paid through the slow accumulation of maintenance costs, through the traffic congestion of tourism, through the environmental impact of development in the Alpine valleys. Today's visitors pay admission fees that barely cover the ongoing costs of preservation. The taxpayers of Bavaria pay the subsidies that bridge the gap. The workers who staff the castle pay with their time and energy, performing labor that is often invisible and rarely acknowledged. The building itself pays with its slow, inevitable decay, the entropic unraveling that no amount of conservation can fully halt. And the world pays something too, something harder to quantify. Every hour spent maintaining Neuschwanstein is an hour not spent on something else. Every euro invested in this castle is a euro not invested in housing or healthcare or education. Every unit of attention devoted to preserving one man's 19th century fantasy is attention drawn away from the challenges of the present and the future. The opportunity cost is real, even if it cannot be precisely calculated. This is not an argument against preservation. Neuschwanstein represents something genuine, the capacity of human beings to create beauty under impossible conditions, to pursue visions that exceed all reasonable bounds, to make something permanent out of something as fleeting as a dream. That capacity is worth protecting. It is worth celebrating. It is worth the sacrifice required to keep it alive. But the sacrifice should not be invisible. The workers who built the castle deserve to be remembered as clearly as the king who commissioned it. The laborers who clean it and guard it and repair it today deserve recognition that goes beyond their wages. The systems that sustain the building, the heating, the water, the electricity, the bureaucracy, the commerce, deserve acknowledgement as essential components of the beauty, not embarrassing intrusions upon it. To see only the fairy tale is to miss half the story. The true story includes the soot in the boiler room and the calluses on the mason's hands and the budget meetings where administrators decide what can be afforded and what must be deferred. Great beauty does not survive on admiration alone. It survives on labor, on money, on compromise, on the willingness of countless people to do unglamorous work so that others can experience something transcendent. This is the hidden economy of splendor, the invisible infrastructure of wonder, and it operates everywhere we find preserved magnificence. In castles and cathedrals, in museums and monuments, in every place that seems to have emerged fully formed from the human imagination. But that, in fact, required generations of effort to create and will require generations more to sustain. Ludwig understood this, perhaps better than his critics have acknowledged. He drove himself to bankruptcy not because he was ignorant of costs, but because he believed the costs were worth paying. He saw his castles not as indulgences, but as necessities, the only environments in which his spirit could survive. that others would have to pay for his vision, in labor, in taxes, in the opportunity cost of what might have been built instead, was a trade-off he was willing to impose, because the alternative, for him, was worse than death. The alternative was a life without beauty, a life in which reality was allowed to overwhelm imagination, a life that was merely practical. Most of us lack Ludwig's resources and his willingness to sacrifice everything for an aesthetic vision. We live practical lives, making practical compromises, deferring our dreams indefinitely because the costs seem too high. And perhaps that is wise. Perhaps Ludwig's story is a cautionary tale, a warning against the dangers of pursuing beauty without regard for consequence. His castles nearly bankrupted Bavaria. His obsession destroyed his health and his sanity. He died alone, in mysterious circumstances, having achieved less than half of what he intended to build. But his castles still stand. More than a century after his death, they draw millions of visitors from around the world, people who come to experience something of the vision that cost him everything. The dream outlasted the dreamer. The beauty outlasted the bankruptcy. Whatever the price Ludwig paid, whatever the price Bavaria continued to pay, the result was something that endures, something that matters, something that adds to the sum of human achievement even as it drains from the sum of human resources. The morning fog is burning off now. Sunlight strikes the upper towers and works its way down the white limestone walls, warming the stone, illuminating the carved balconies and the pointed turrets and the grand entrance where visitors will soon begin to queue. In the courtyard, a maintenance worker is sweeping away leaves that fell overnight. In the ticket office, computers are being powered up, reservations verified, schedules confirmed. In the basement, the heating system is adjusting to the new day's demands, maintaining the temperature and humidity within the narrow ranges that preservation requires. Somewhere in the administrative offices, a budget meeting is underway. The scaffolding for next year's restoration project is being planned. The contracts for seasonal guides are being reviewed. The projections for visitor numbers are being revised based on economic conditions and travel trends and the unpredictable fluctuations of public interest. None of this is visible from the castle's famous silhouette. None of it appears in the photographs that will be shared on social media today, seen by millions, inspiring some fraction of those millions to add Neuschwanstein to their travel lists, to make the journey to Bavaria, to climb the mountain and pay the admission fee and walk through rooms where a lonely king once walked alone. The castle will still be here tomorrow, and the day after that, and the year after that, and the decade, and perhaps the century, if the resources hold out, if the climate allows, if the political will persists, if the strange alchemy of tourism and taxation and cultural commitment continues to produce the revenue and the expertise and the motivation required. Nothing is guaranteed. Nothing is permanent. Ludwig built for eternity, but eternity is maintained in daily increments, each one requiring decisions and sacrifices and trade-offs that he could never have anticipated. We who visit places like Neuschwanstein are inheritors of a bargain we did not negotiate. The castle exists because Ludwig was willing to impoverish himself for beauty. It persists because generations of workers were willing to labor in its shadow, maintaining what he created. It will continue to exist only if we, collectively, through our governments and our ticket purchases and our cultural priorities, decide that it is worth sustaining. This is not a passive inheritance. It is an active choice, renewed every year, every budget cycle, every policy decision. The fairy tale we tell about Neuschwanstein is a simplification. The mad king, the tragic death, the castle in the clouds It makes a good story, but it obscures the complexity of what was actually achieved and what is actually required to preserve it. The truth is less romantic, but more remarkable. Thousands of people across more than a century have devoted their lives to maintaining a structure that one troubled man built for his private consolation. They have done this work not because they shared Ludwig's vision, but because they recognized something worth preserving in what he created. They have balanced the books when the books did not balance. They have solved problems that Ludwig could not have imagined. They have kept the dream alive through wars and depressions and pandemics and the slow erosion of time. This is the real legacy of Neuschwanstein, not the architecture, as extraordinary as it is, not the story of Ludwig, as compelling as it remains, but the accumulated effort of all the unnamed people who made it possible, the masons and the carpenters, the servants and the guides, the conservators and the administrators, the taxpayers and the visitors. They are the true builders of the castle, building it again every day, laying stone upon invisible stone, sustaining what would otherwise crumble into ruin. Ludwig sleeps in a crypt beneath the church of St. Michael in Munich, far from his mountains, far from his castles, far from everything he loved. His grave is modest by royal standards, a black marble slab in a dim crypt visited mostly by tourists who have come for the architecture and stumble upon the dead king almost by accident. He left no heirs. His dynasty ended with him, or nearly. His brother Otto, the mad one, technically reigned for decades, but from a locked room, never seen, never consulted, a legal fiction maintained until the monarchy itself was abolished in 1918. But Ludwig's castles remain. They are his true legacy, the children he never had, the continuation of his bloodline in stone and wood and gilt. And like children, they require constant care, constant attention, constant sacrifice from those who choose to love them. The love is not unconditional. The love is transactional, paid for in labor and money and compromise. But it is love nonetheless, and it has sustained Neuschwanstein through everything the world has thrown at it. The fog is gone now. The castle stands in full sunlight, impossibly white against the blue sky, its towers reaching toward the heavens as if straining to escape the earth that holds them. In an hour, the first tour will begin, the first of thousands today, the first of millions this year. Each visitor will see the beauty and feel the wonder, and perhaps for a moment, imagine what it would be like to live in such a place, surrounded by such magnificence, removed from the ordinary concerns of ordinary life, and then they will leave. They will descend the mountain and return to the world, and the castle will remain, waiting, enduring, demanding its payment, offering its beauty in return, holding up its end of a bargain that has now lasted more than a century, and must last for centuries more, if what Ludwig created is to survive. Great beauty does not sustain itself. It is sustained by work and money and will and the collective decision renewed endlessly that some things are worth more than their cost. This is the truth that Neuschwanstein teaches if we are willing to learn it. This is the truth that every fairy tale conceals and every honest accounting reveals. The castle was never free. Nothing beautiful ever is. When you look at a place of extraordinary beauty, do you see only what was built, or do you also see the invisible labor, sacrifice, and ongoing cost that makes it possible to exist today?